Aarushi is a pure non-fiction work. It's about, to begin with, a ghastly double murder that took place in a Delhi suburb called Noida in 2008, where a 13-year-old girl was found dead in her bedroom with having received a blunt blow, that her head was clubbed and her throat slit. It drew a lot of attention for that one reason only, because of the location of the crime, in that it took place in this middle class idyll, if you will, where such things aren't supposed to happen. Her parents were successful dentists. You could say of the upper middle class. Not especially rich, but on the cusp of being very well known, very successful. The whole thing took a twist in about 24 hours time, when a second body, that of the manservant who was at that time missing on the first day and was in fact the prime suspect. His name was Hemraj. Now his body was found on the terrace of the flats that Dr. Rajesh and Nupur Talwar lived in, and which was Aarushi's home. With that discovery, the case drew national headlines, and it occupied, much more than its fair share of media coverage, especially on television. It seemed like a television story of a tabloidish nature, because the murders were gruesome, and very soon after the discovery of these two bodies, what happened was there was injection of the aroma of sex, if you will, into the mix, which then made it a story which is even more watched, and this is a fact, than many Indian Premier League cricket games. So news television made this story, gave it its own life. Now what happened thereafter is that a whole set of investigations took place, and the initial investigation under the UP police came under a lot of fire, because within a week of the incident happening, the police had decided exactly who the murderers were and how the crimes had been committed. Whereas, at the time at least, there was no investigation at all. There were only some statements. The case, under some kind of political pressure, and which is there in the book, was transferred, as most important cases are, to that agency which a lot of Indians repose, I think, an inordinate amount of faith in, and that is the CBI. They're supposed to solve everything, sort everything out, crack every case, put all the bad guys away, all of that. That investigation then went to the CBI, which for a time did its job, but, and that's detailed in the book, for several months it really got no closer to solving this murder, which seemed odd because the number of suspects weren't that many, but somehow or the other things weren't tied up. So of the 5 suspects, or rather 4 at the time, because Aarushi's mother Nupur Talwar was never a suspect to begin with, Dr. Rajesh Talwar and 3 other domestic help who worked in that area, while they were in custody, there was an attempt to charge sheet the 3 servants, but this attempt failed, again detailed in the book. Dr. Rajesh Talwar was released after about 50 days in custody, and the other servants got their release in any case, because charge sheet wasn't filed. 90 days later they were out, and they, in one sense, disappeared to wherever they came from. Now, what happened as a result is that the case itself came to a standstill, and the media pressure to solve it, crack it, whatever you might call it, remained intense. A year later, about a year later, the CBI, under a new director, formed a new team where the line of investigation taken by the earlier CBI team that was looking at the case was completely reversed, and the suspicion placed back on the Talwars. You might ask why this happened. It happened for many reasons. One of the simpler ones is that of the 5 people who may have been suspects, only 2 were available to prosecute. The CBI didn't know where the others were. There are a number of other reasons too, which I go into in the book. But then starts this new, supposedly new investigation. However, at the end of this too, there was no real conclusion, or that was the claim. In cases like this, when you cannot or do not think as an agency that you have enough to prosecute your suspect, what you file is a closure report. You present that to a magistrate, who then says, well, since you don't have enough evidence for this to go to trial, we will close it, and it remains an unsolved case. That was a decision that the agency took at the end of 2010, and a closure report was filed. However, the nature of the closure report, in terms of its tone and the way it was written, made it kind of very clear that by exclusion, not by investigation, there were only 2 people who could have been involved in the murders, and those were Aarushi's parents, Dr. Rajesh and Nupur Talwar. The magistrate who was supposed to receive the closure report and give her orders on it, took the view that unlike the CBI claim that there wasn't enough evidence to convict the Talwars or take the case to trial, that they should be tested at the trial stage. So she sent the case to trial. Several things happened in between. The trial itself began only in 2012, middle of 2012. Took about a year and a half, at the end of which, based purely on circumstantial evidence, the Talwars were convicted of the murder of Aarushi and Hemraj and sent to prison, Dasna jail, serving a life sentence, where they are today. So it's the in-between part really, that's the most interesting in the story. No, in fact, it wouldn't be correct to say that. My reporting on the case for a Mumbai newspaper called The Mirror starts only at the trial stage, and the previous parts, the 4 years that have gone before, for those I depend on research. But from 2012 onwards, or mid 2012 onwards, you could say it's an eyewitness account of what happened. So that's how I covered the story. Yeah, while the trial was on, yes. Yes, one of the principles of any intuitive or even written law is the presumption of innocence in any case. Unfortunately, in the Aarushi case, and perhaps it happens elsewhere as well, this principle was reversed. It was the presumption of guilt that had the most role to play in this. The presumption of guilt involves the transference of the burden of proof onto the defendant. This is what happened in the Aarushi case, and it's not supposed to happen. That is what is wrong with this judgment and the way this was handled. I speak not just of the judicial process here. The presumption of guilt runs much deeper in this case than merely being confined to a court. It runs into the way the criminal investigation took place, the way the media covered it, and the way the consumers of media, people like you and me, took in this story. We had written this couple off as murderers well before any court decided on their fate. I was speaking this morning about how this can be a vicious cycle. It is much easier to believe that a deviant of some sort in our society could be a murderer. And the Talwars were cast as deviants through selective leaks to the media, through the kind of things said about them, through the kind of questions that were asked of them and their relatives or their friends, and a picture of a debauched, and to use the word again, deviant couple emerged well before the trial even began. So the leap from deviant to murderer is a much easier one to take. Already in the court of public opinion, the Talwars had lost. People went with the belief that they must have done it. And they must have done it because they were already cast as these not very nice people with certain kinds of behavior which we don't generally accept in polite, civilized society. The fact of the matter is there was no truth to any of this. The media just took it in and reported it stenographically from whoever was leaking the stories. Once this happens and the matter goes to court, remember that judicial officers of every level are not drawn from outside society. They are just as susceptible to the influences of their environment as any of the rest of us. They are not more or less human than any of us. So it becomes a disincentive for this process and all the players in it to run counter to what is called public sentiment, which is already established. Now, this becomes self-serving because at the end you have a judgment which overall confirms what the public already knew. Yeah, just to complete that thought, what happens once you get that kind of judgment which is in line with the spirit of public sentiment? The media reports the judgment once again as a reaffirmation of their position and what they disseminated. So it's slapping itself on the back at the same time. The investigating agency looks at the media's coverage in this renewed scenario as a confirmation of what they believed in the first place. And the judge says, since everybody is happy, then I must have done the right thing. So this is a cyclonic system in the middle of which were two people really who were upper middle class and with very little interaction or opportunity to interact with what I'd call the arms of the state. It's a situation, God forbid, that you and I can also find ourselves in, because these things are actually new to us. We don't know how it operates. And that's the larger picture, if you will, and that's why this case is important. There's a three-tier system which in our judiciary, which is designed to correct any errors made in the process. Now, that's the stage they're at. They have been convicted. So the Aarushi story is still being written in one sense. Yes, they have been convicted by a lower court. They now go to the Allahabad High Court and the evidence is read over once again as if no judgment had come in the first place. And then a learned judge from there will decide on whether it was enough or not to convict these people. If he feels, or she, if he or she feels that the conviction was valid, he upholds it, and they have their last recourse, which is the Supreme Court, which is where they can go finally. So that the tools for redressal exist. To the extent that what has been dealt out to you may be reversed. However, there are no tools for the redressal of the real losses that one suffers as a result of being involved in something like this. At the end of 20 years, say, if the Talwars are found innocent by some higher court, who pays back the 20 years of their lives that they have lost? What do they live with? So this is not a new scenario. I mean, in the Allahabad High Court, where they are going in for appeal, there are appeals which are pending since the 1980s. In the same court, in the same Ghaziabad court, a gentleman called Moninder Singh Pandher, who was allegedly involved in the Nithari killings. All major murders seem to happen in Noida. Was convicted and I think spent about 6 or 7 years in jail before his conviction was overturned by a higher court. So these things happen. The important thing, I think the parts that I like to harp on about this case is that this is not, it is not my argument that there should be a wholesale revolution, that every court building should be razed to the ground and we should start some new system. No. It's also a gross generalization, which I find unacceptable in rational terms. To say that on the basis of this one case, to say the entire system is wrong and therefore you need a revolution. No. The only thing you can say with certainty is that, look, the system has room for and allows, in some cases encourages, a travesty of justice such as Aarushi Talwar. That's the part you need to address. The tools of the system are available and good. For instance, nobody in their right minds can tear up, can tear up seals of forensic science labs without a court order. This was done regularly in the Aarushi case. So the integrity of that evidence itself is compromised straight away. There were 56 pieces of evidence which were sealed by the CDFD in Hyderabad. They were ripped open, things swapped, things changed, new labels put, resealed and brought back to court. As a citizen, as a consumer of the system, I ask only this: do I not deserve better as a litigant in this country? Is it all right? Is it acceptable to you? Is it acceptable that a post-mortem report, the final document in anyone's life, changes 6 times over 2.5 years after the death of the person? Is it all right for policemen and forensic experts to lie through their teeth, basically, as they offer testimony under oath? Is it okay for experienced policemen to say that, in one instance, that the body wasn't putrefying because I couldn't smell anything, it seemed fine? When asked, it's been out there, Hemraj's body was out there in the May heat of Delhi on the terrace for 48 hours and everybody else saw it putrefying, it was stinking. This gentleman then says, but you see, I have no sense of smell. Another gentleman comes and says that he can't see. An obvious forgery is pointed out, an addition to an important document. And the person says, we needed to fill up that line which seemed empty. This is why we put it in later. Is all of this acceptable? Is it acceptable for a judge to start writing a judgment even before one of the sides has begun its final arguments? Is it all right again for a judge to invent evidence? Is it all right for a judge to take the help of his lawyer's son in the writing of a judgment? So there are a number of issues that come up in terms of accountability and the system. But I think the importance of the story is not just that. For me at least, the learning from this story is of a different nature altogether. In the time that I spent going to Ghaziabad, to that courtroom, interviewing people who were involved or in some way participants in the drama, this story taught me a lot about who we are as Indians, where we live, and the kind of mosaic that makes up India, and the kind of attitudes in that mosaic of different sets of people. Look, no system is perfect, and there's a red flag with that I'd raise straight off, which is that in the jury system, an understanding of law and reason is somehow subverted, I believe, by what's overall a popular opinion, like a vote. Evidence is something which is cold. A jury reacts warmly. It reacts with emotion. This is my belief. They may well be excellent juries of very well read and people well versed with the case, but that we cannot have that expectation from a jury. From a judge, we should. In fact, we should demand it. We need for him or her to understand law, first of all, not merely intuitively, but in both letter and spirit. We need him to understand aspects of evidence gathering and the integrity of evidence, and to stick by those principles. We also need them, I think, and this is where I'll come back to the point, of to not be in opposition to fundamental civilizational principles such as the presumption of innocence. We can't have that. But that's what their training is meant for. That's what they're supposed to have understood in the first place. I don't know about gung-ho, but we certainly like them, to the extent that especially the vanquished enemy is someone we really like. We celebrate it. I had written a piece some time back in a Pakistani newspaper on precisely this. Personally, I was saddened by the way in which Kasab's hanging was celebrated all around this country. I wouldn't say all around this country, but a number of pockets. I mean, diabetics gorged themselves on sweets on that day because Kasab was hanged. Now, once again, personally, I'm anti the death sentence. There are a number of arguments both for and against it. That's a separate discussion. But I don't think there can be any argument about the idea of actually taking out victory processions because some poor fellow, a villager from remote Pakistan, has been hung or hanged. I don't see how this really helps us, but it seems to work as a popular device. That's why you have people in those processions. And the casting of that person as the enemy is something that we all participate in. A consensus is built up. So in the case of Kasab, that's different, because I guess it's different because it's much easier, in fact, to cast him as the enemy. We already have the situation on terrorism in Pakistan and all of these things. So to posit him as part of a group of people who are out to blow everything up and kill all of us is easy. But there's a filter down subtler effect of this, which is anybody who, like I said, is not doing exactly what you might want him to do is also the enemy. Or in some cases, anyone who's doing some things that you secretly really want to do is also the enemy. That's why the Talwars were accused of having these orgies, and everyone went shame, shame. No wonder that family broke up. No wonder they killed their daughter. Now the leap from debauch to murderer requires something called evidence in between. There was no evidence of any of that. But the story or the narrative still stood. And public sentiment was built up. Yeah. So your question is probably, I don't know about gung-ho, but we certainly like our enemies.